You're watching a Highwire Media podcast.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our brand new episode of Dead Reckoning podcast. As always, this episode is brought to you by NordVPN. And tonight, it's the walking statues of Rapa Nui, which is a pronunciation I definitely looked at before this. Now, normally I don't like to bother. I mean, it sounds like way too much work, doesn't it? But given that it's the subject of today's video, I thought it would be a good idea. Anyways, let's jump into it. Let's see what there is to decode, because I don't think statues can walk. On the shores of a tiny windswept island, 7 statues patiently gazed out over the open seas. In the distance, a tiny speck appears, bobbing up and down in the restless ocean. Slowly, the speck becomes 3, and finally, the 3 specks turn into the 3 ships fighting their way through the pounding waves. It would be interesting to know who was more surprised, the 7 statues seeming really big and impressive canoes for the first time, or their crew aboard the 3 ships coming across a small island that, up to that point, no one knew existed, and being greeted by locals dressed in bright colors and looming up behind them. Really big stone heads. Tell you who wasn't surprised? The stone heads, because they're made of stone. They can't be surprised. Ever since that fateful Easter Sunday in 1722, when Dutch Admiral Jacob Roggeveen, I know I butchered that name, came across the tiny piece of land he creatively called Easter Island, the Western world has been captivated by the giant statues called moai that can be found all over the island. The Dutch admiral himself stayed for one day. He was looking for a continent, Terra Australis, not another island, but his visit was the first of many to come. The past, I always say, was the worst. The past, in this case, kind of awesome. These were people out there exploring the world, and they're like, no, I'm not looking for some boring island. I'm looking for a continent. And it's like today, I feel like all the islands have been discovered, right? I mean, we have satellite technology, and it's like there's no big secret island out there that no one's discovered. That is actually awesome. What a disappointing time we live in. My disappointment is immeasurable. Excuse me. Today, thousands of tourists flock to the island to see the enigmatic moai, and researchers have spent years trying to figure out the secrets of the giant statues, with limited success. Sadly, much of the history of the islanders known as the Rapa Nui and the story of the walking moai have been forgotten by a people that was nearly wiped out by multiple disasters that befell them. And let me guess, some of these disasters have got to do with the Dutch dude arriving, because it's like, yeah, they're all getting on a ship, and oh yeah, smallpox, the plague, all that, horrible. Through all that, the moai have stood, patiently watching the story of the island unfold. They've seen it all. They know all the secrets. But like most ancient gods, they have no intention of sharing. Not that they can. They're made of stone. What makes Easter Island, or Rapa Nui, as it's known by the locals, so unique are the statues. Close to 1,000 statues of different sizes have been found standing or lying down all around the island. Only there are 1,000 of them. I thought there were like 5. So that's a lot. They were busy on the island making those statues. They were probably like, yeah, no farming. Nah, hunting? No. Looking after our kids? No, it's an island. What's the worst that can happen? Nope. Building massive statues? Yes. Through archaeological excavations and conservation efforts, some of the fallen statues have been returned to their platforms, but most of them are still buried up to their shoulders, leading to the mistaken belief that they're nothing more than heads. There's a body underneath them. It better be a tiny-ass body, because otherwise those statues are going to be buried deep. On average, a moai can weigh up to 80 tons and stand around 10 meters tall. However, the largest found to date weighs around 150 tons and stands at an impressive 20 meters or 66 feet, with the smallest moai only standing at 1.13 meters or 3.7 feet. Some of the moai also wear a pakao. I know I butchered that name. I forgot to look it up before I recorded this. The pakao is made from soft redstone and shaped like a hat. Probably represents some kind of headdress or perhaps a top knot. The moai all appear to be male, though a handful of female moai have been found with an oversized head and similar facial features, a long, sloping nose, deep-set eyes with a narrow mouth, and a very prominent chin. The news that the statues had bodies took the world by storm in around 2012. No archaeologists have ever been to Easter Island and been like, have we considered digging below them, see if there's anything down there? Because isn't that literally the job description of an archaeologist? Have a dig at the ground and see if anything's down there? Below a giant head would seem like a great place to look. The archaeological community, however, had known about the bodies since 1914. The statues have been standing around the island for hundreds of years, so most are still buried in rocks and sediment, which both hid but also preserved the bodies. It's not the full body, though, it's just the torso and two arms. Each statue sits on a stone platform called an ahu, and an ahu can contain up to a dozen statues. The platform is a raised rectangular platform made with large worked stones and a ramp paved with beach pebbles. The area in front of the platform is usually leveled, so far around 360 of these of the platforms have been found. Research suggests that the construction of these megalithic platforms probably started around the 13th century. The largest found to date, and probably the most photographed of the lot, is the Ahu Tangariki, which contains 15 moai. Yes, I know I'm butchering some of these names. In my mind, these are just like scattered around the island, and their heads poke out of the ground. I didn't realize there were so many, or that they were like clustered together like this. I'd say I'd like to go to Easter Island, but I know it's in the middle of nowhere. What you need to know is that Easter Island is off the coast of Chile. And I still think it does take a really long ass time to get there. So no, I'm not going. I don't think I'll ever go there. It's too much travel for too little excitement. Like if they were like, yeah, we got like adventures on Easter Island, I'd be like, sweet, but just to see some statues that I can look up on Google. I know it sounds super uncultured, but I don't really need to go there and see those in person. The statues stand with their backs to the ocean, looking inland towards the people who made them. One exception is a 7 moai on Ahu Akivi. Legend goes that they face the ocean to help lost travelers find their way. Yeah, they'd be like, yo, Dutch, lost traveler, over here, over here, over here. Around 95% of the statues were carved at Raraku Quarry, an extinct volcano from volcanic tuff, a porous stone formed from solidified ash. The native islanders didn't have metal, and the tuff being a soft stone would have been easier to work with their limited stone tools. These were basalt picks known as toki. Oh, I hate butchering these names. The Raraku Quarry is home to statues in various stages of production, which gives us a good idea of how these statues were carved. There are also several completed statues still waiting patiently in the quarry for transport that will never arrive. Come on, archaeologists, finish the job, grab the statues and pop them in a good place. I know that's not how archaeology works, but it's how I wish it worked. It's like, yeah, Leaning Tower of Pisa, prop it up. What else is broken? The Great Wall of China, fix that, it's all falling down. Each statue was probably commissioned by a specific person or group and carved by a team of stoneworkers working under a master carver. They would start by quarrying a large rectangular block, first carving out the front and sides of the statue, gradually separating the back from the quarry rock. Once the basic figure was carved out, the master carver and his assistants would add some of the details. When this was done and the statue was separated from the quarry rock, it would be moved downhill and placed upright in a hole so that the master and his little helpers could finish the rest of the detailed work and the back of the statue. Finally, the statue was ready to move. Eye holes would only be carved once the moai arrived at its destination. Placing the paku on the head became part of the process much later. It seems that the idea to put hats on the massive statues only started around the 15th and 16th centuries. These headdresses, with a diameter of up to 2 meters, 6.5 feet, weighed up to 12 tons. They were quarried from the red stone at the quarry before being moved to the statues to give them a new look. Once the hat was on and all the final details carved, eyes of coral would be added, finally turning the moai into a ringa ora, or a living face, and that process was complete. Why would the eyes be made of coral? Is there some sort of coral that I don't know? Portal me, isn't that like the spindly stuff? Like, how does that work as an eye? Despite the small size of the island and the fact that a little over 1,000 moai have already been found, new moai are still being discovered. This is actually crazy. The most recent one was found in February 2023 in a dry lake bed. The sculpture is smaller than the other statues on the island, but it was an exciting moment for researchers who believe that there could be even more lying around the revered quarry waiting to be uncovered. Again, at the risk of sounding like super uncultured, it's like, yeah, what did you expect? It's going to be some buried statue underground. It was centuries ago. They're like, oh wow, exciting, another statue. You found 1,000 of them. How exciting can it be? Why this little guy was in the lake in the first place is a bit of a mystery. However, moai love company and apparently tend to travel in packs. So when there's one statue, there's probably more. And archaeologists just can't wait to find the rest. Like, I think archaeology is cool sometimes. Also, the other times you're going to be like, oh god, that's boring. Like, what's your job going to be for the next few years? Literally just uncovering more of the same. The story of the statue builders who first settled the island is one of the many mysteries of the Rapa Nui. The small island, only around 63 square miles, lies in the southeastern Pacific Ocean, uh, 2,000 kilometers away from the islands of southeastern Polynesia and around 3,600 kilometers away from mainland Chile in South America. There were miles. Oh, I had mile conversions, but they're just all thousands. It's like far. Let's just say it's like a long way to paddle a canoe. While some argue that it's unlikely early navigators and seafarers could have covered such vast distances without precision instruments, the Polynesians were among the first skilled seafarers, so they probably wouldn't have had any problem finding their way to Rapa Nui as it became known. When exactly they arrived is also up for debate, but it appears that once they arrived in their new home, they remained there in complete isolation. No one ever returned to the mainland, and no one from the mainland dropped in for tea. But then, if thousands of visitors go there, they're not going to get a boat for like a week, are they? Sounds pretty grim. And whenever I'm on those things, whenever it's like, oh yeah, you do that, it's like you get on a boat for a week and you go to these islands, it's like, what if I get sick? It's literally a week back on the boat. Excavations at the beach in the Rapa Nui National Park show signs of early settlement in the form of charcoal, tools, and even bones. The researchers doing the excavations figured that this might be the original settlement. These finds were dated to around 1200, suggesting that this was when the people first arrived. However, a 1977 study analyzing pollen claims that deforestation started as early as 800 CE, which would mean that new inhabitants arrived 400 years before Anakina Beach became home to a settlement. Again, apologies for butchering these names. Joanne Van Tilburg, founder of the Easter Island Statue Project, feels it's unlikely that the original setters only arrived in 1200, considering that the locals were already building platforms by the 1200s, and there were signs of crop intensification, which would suggest that the Rapa Nui had been around for a while by that time. One thing that has researchers scratching their heads is how exactly the new settlers knew where to find the small island. Did they know? Surely they're just like, I don't know, people in the past were like brave. They'd be like, let's go out exploring, get in the canoe, see where it takes us. And they go out in the Pacific Ocean, probably not realizing quite how big it is. They drift around for a while. They probably get super hungry and they're like, oh, thank God, an island. Let's go build some statues. It seems unlikely that a group of people loaded some canoes and just struck out blindly into the wide ocean in the hope of finding land. I mean, yeah, but like I said, they didn't really know how big it was. They'd just be like, it can't be that far to the nearest island. You don't have any idea how big the Pacific is, do you? Can't blame them. I mean, it was the past. They didn't know. However, if you ask some Rapa Nui Islanders, they have a pretty good idea of how it all went down. I'm going to butcher these names again. Benedicto Tuki, an islander since passed on, claimed to be a descendant of the island's first king, Hoto Matua, and his grandmother was the last queen of the island. According to tales told to him, Hoto brought his people from Eva, an island in the Marquesas, due to fighting there. He arrived on the island with 7 different races who then became the 7 different tribes of Rapa Nui. How many people are there? 7 different tribes arriving by canoes? I don't feel like that's realistic. Hotu knew where to go because his tattooist and priest had seen the island in a dream and described it in great detail. Okay then, well, we know that's not real. Hotu decided that the island was the ideal home to settle his people and set sail in canoes loaded with people, food, water, plant cuttings, and animals. Everything a group of settlers would need to survive. They sailed across the sea for 2 months before finally arriving at the bay, finding the island exactly the way the tattooist saw it in his dream. However, this is just one version of how the islanders came to the island. Other stories tell of 7 explorers sent out by Hotu Matua to find the island. Like many island cultures, the Rapa Nui history was passed down from one generation to the next in the form of stories and songs, which, while entertaining, is not a brilliant way of recording history. So it's not surprising that the stories evolved. However they got there, the island the new arrivals found themselves on was beautiful and rugged, but without the abundance of natural resources that you'd usually expect to find on a tropical island. The soil is still not well suited to agriculture, and fresh water is scarce, as the island has no permanent freshwater streams. I mean, it's a small island, but it's still fairly large as islands go, and there's no permanent freshwater streams. That sucks. You'd be like, oh no, this wasn't the island I want. There's nothing to drink. Unlike most other islands, there are also no large coral reefs offshore and no lagoons. However, despite these limitations, the Rapa Nui still managed to grow some staples like yam, sweet potato, and sugarcane. And while they couldn't feast on shellfish, the fishing around the island is pretty good. So they probably had enough food to go around at first. Always at first. Now there are 2 versions of what happened to the Rapa Nui people. One is a cautionary tale of what happens to the environment when people start getting greedy and overpopulate and overwork their lands. It's good we've all learned that lesson. Easter Island sported forests of palm trees for thousands of years, possibly as many as 16 million trees, with some standing 30 meters high. Excuse me, that's a lot of trees, which means hell of a lot of coconuts. And if you crack those bad boys open, you know what's inside? Drinkable, delicious coconut water. When people first arrived, they needed fire to cook, and they needed to clear the land for farming, which led to large parts of the forest being chopped down and burned in order to clear the land. Once they started building the moai and the ahu, they needed timber for construction and possibly for moving the statues. Of course, once the trees were gone, the soil eroded. And if they'd already cut out all the trees, well, the birds packed up their stuff and set off for distant lands or just died out. They probably died out, unless they were migratory birds. Excuse me. And without trees to build shelter and, more importantly, canoes for fishing, life on the island became difficult, and soon the population was faced with widespread starvation. However, some researchers feel that this isn't an accurate portrayal of what happened on the island. Humans can be very destructive. We've proven that many times over. But researchers Terry Hunt and Carl Lippo weren't convinced that the settlers alone could have caused so much damage. The discovery of rat bones might solve that mystery. When the people arrived, they brought with them the Polynesian rat, either as a food source or unintentionally in the form of ratty stowaways. With an unlimited food supply in the form of delicious palm trees and no natural predators, rather than those pesky humans, it was rat heaven. And you know what rat heaven means? Lots of delicious rats. With rats munching down on the seeds and eventually the new saplings, it became impossible for the palm trees to regenerate. Add people chopping down trees and rapid deforestation becomes inevitable. The reports by early European explorers seem to support this version of events. In the original reports of the island, the moai were still standing, and he estimated the population to be around 8,000. When Captain Cook arrived in 1774, he reported that there were no trees over 10 feet tall, and he estimated the population was around 700. That's a massive loss. In 1821, Captain Thomas Rain, sailing out of Australia, reported that the inhabitants of the island swam out to meet the ship, and there wasn't a canoe in sight. thus confirming reports of a lack of seaworthy canoes. However, these early accounts aren't always reliable. Only 12 years after Cook's visit, another explorer, Jean-Francois de la Prouze, estimated the population of Rapa Nui to be between 2,000 and 3,000 people. So either Cook or the French explorer had a bit of trouble with numbers and counting. The picture of the Rapa Nui destroying their land with the help of some rats was accepted for many years. But how true is this really? Archaeologists love to disagree about things. Some state that the island population might have been up to 15,000 or even 20,000 people at its peak. However, the poor soil and lack of fresh water would have been limiting factors, so a population explosion is unlikely. The population probably remained steady at 3,000 people from the mid-1300s until the arrival of the Europeans in 1722. Recent research also suggests that the deforestation happened gradually, not overnight, and there's even evidence that attempts at reforestation were made. However, even with the trees gone, the people adapted to their environment and were still healthy, happy, and according to some research, still building Maui to stand on them by the time the Europeans set foot on the island. Once the Europeans arrived, however, things started going downhill fast as the population was decimated by diseases like smallpox and also the slave trade. The Europeans simply bagged the locals to sell in the slave markets. By 1877, the once proud people had been reduced from 3,000 to 111. A few articles claim that the people who built the statues had all vanished, and what happened to them is a big mystery. But that's not true. The Rapa Nui are resilient people, and today the population stands around 2,000 native Rapa Nui within a total population of 7,000 people living on the island. Based on their oral traditions, we know that the Rapa Nui who built the statues were living in a complex society with chiefs, priests, and aristocracy, but also had people who took great pride in their work. Many of the lower castes became master craftsmen, carvers, divers, canoe builders in their own right. Many of the crafts, song, and dances of the great statue builders are kept alive by their descendants. So much like the statues, the people lived through some difficult times, but they're still very much alive and kicking. So the big question is, why were the Maui made? Carving and then moving the huge Maui took some time, so it stands to reason that if you're going to be making very large statues, you probably have a good reason to make them, right? I mean, sort of. You think it's a good reason, but it's a not good reason. And my bet is sky gods. Unfortunately, we're not really sure what reason was, but as always, we have some theories. Throughout history, large statues have often had some kind of religious or ritual purpose. According to the Dutch explorer, when he arrived on the island in 1722, he found the native islanders praying and performing rituals to honor the Maui. He noted in his ship logs that the people of the island didn't appear to be carrying weapons, which must have made his colonizing heart beat just a bit faster. But instead, they appeared to rely on their gods or idols, standing along the seashore in great numbers for protection. You'd be like, as a colonizer, you'd be like, excellent. Idiots think the gods are going to protect them. Only my god is right. Like many other ancient cultures, the Egyptians come to mind. The Rapa Nui believed their chiefs and rulers were descendants from gods. After death, the chiefs would again reach divinity. The statues were meant as temporary housing for the spirits of their ancestors, to keep the spirits safe until an apartment opens up and they can move on to the next plane. Either that or the statues were meant to capture the spirit and keep it safe so it could continue to help the tribe. Archaeologists have discovered human remains at some of the Ahu, which further supports the idea that these were sites for death rituals. This is also why the statues needed to resemble humans, as they were used to honor the dead. Instead of just remembering the revered ancestors, the people wanted a physical image to represent each chief. So the theory goes that the Maui are the faces of the dead ancestors. The first statues were smaller, but eventually they started getting bigger. This could be due to mana, an important concept in Rapa Nui beliefs. Um, yeah, I apologize for butchering it. Mana or mana, however you actually pronounce it, is a sacred and spiritual power that comes from divinity and is channeled to the people, those who are descendants of the gods themselves. It's the divine life force, the source of energy responsible for fertility of the earth and seas. So researchers believe a larger statue meant that the chief who ordered it had more mana. The chief next door saw this, and in a classic case of keeping up with the Joneses, decided to make an even bigger moai to have even more mana and power, and so on, leading to some of the huge Maui standing and lying, or Maui, I keep butchering these names, standing and lying around the island today. Another theory suggests that since the statues had religious significance, any disaster that befell the island was met with a bigger statue. A disastrous crop failure led to an even bigger Maui to honor and pledge or please the ancestors and gods so that they'd provide a better harvest next time. Again, this is exactly the case of they think it's brilliant and exactly what they should be doing, but objectively, it's a terrible idea. They should instead be using that money to, I don't know, make weapons to actually keep away the Dutch, or make crops so they don't starve to death, or maybe just stop chopping down the trees. But do the statues represent people? However, anthropologist Carl Lippo doesn't believe that the statues represent ancestors. The statues are very generic, and while the features are exaggerated, the statues don't seem to have specific defining features like you'd expect to find on a statue carved to honor a specific person. Think of the Greek and Roman sculptures of important figures like Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar, or the Egyptian statues of pharaohs. There are also no Anu or statues found on top of hills, a place where you'd expect a monument to be built, especially if it's supposed to be symbolic. So the alternative theory is status and tribal competition. Another possible explanation is that the statues are competitive in nature, considering the variety in sizes. According to legends, there were originally 7 tribes, but today there are about 36 different clans on the island. With a variety of culturally distinct and separate clans or tribes, the statues could have served as status symbols, essentially the ancient equivalent of a fancy new car, a big house, or in South Africa, a tennis court in your backyard. The larger the statue, the more resources, especially in the form of labor, went into making it, proving that a particular tribe was flourishing. If you can afford to spare men to carve statues instead of farming or fishing, well, you're doing very well indeed. Considering the limited resources on the island, you'd expect conflict. However, there isn't much evidence for prolonged and particularly lethal warfare. There are no fortifications on the island, and while skeletons with clear signs of injury have been found, those injuries were rarely lethal. So perhaps the islanders were smart enough to realize their small population couldn't sustain extended warfare, and instead of killing each other by the hundred, they engaged in territorial displays by building more and bigger moai than the tribe just down the road. But I don't really believe that one because at some point they're going to be like, yeah. But if we burn the tribe down the road, there's going to be more resources for us. And also, they're going to be building no moai at all, not even tiny ones. Personally, I think they're trying to make better art than the other fellow is, a far more civilized form of warfare. And the Europeans should have been taking notes instead of selling the locals into slavery. Now for Carl Lippo's theory, which is resource markers. Carl Lippo, however, believed that the moai were used as a landmark of sorts, indicating where to find valuable resources. After mapping the exact locations of the moai, Lippo and his team discovered that the moai were often located next to important resources, like workable land for agriculture, fresh water, or good fishing spots. Doesn't that also just mean it's where the people were going, like in general? So they'd be like, that's a nice place for a moai, isn't it? Because we're just fishing here one afternoon. Bob's like, you want to build one of those moai? They're like, yeah, let's put it over there, rather than some random place we'd never get to. However, for the most part, the statues were found close to a freshwater source suitable for humans. Fresh water is an incredibly valuable resource on the island, as the island has no permanent streams. And there's no real evidence that the natives relied on the lakes, as the lakes and springs were sitting atop volcanic cores. They were hard to reach and far from settlements, so it's unlikely they were used as a steady water supply. Rainfall was unpredictable, and when it rained, the rain would drain into aquifers. The groundwater would then seep into the caves and appear in streams on the coast. Lippo and his team first noticed these freshwater streams on the coast when they saw horses drinking from what appeared to be the ocean. As we all know, drinking seawater is a bad idea, and horses aren't stupid. So they probably weren't drinking the seawater, which is how the researchers discovered the brackish streams that provided the locals with drinking water. According to historical records, some of the ahu were found without an obvious freshwater source nearby, but historic wells indicate that the locals would make a plan to get water and dug wells. Considering the time and effort involved carving a statue and transporting it, the statues were probably not used as markers to indicate, find your freshwater source here. However, fresh water is vital for drinking and farming. So it makes sense that these spots would be considered important and possibly even sacred, making it an ideal spot for a moai, the embodiment of a sacred ancestor. But again, I'll just say if you're erecting a massive statue, even if you've carved it elsewhere, it's going to be quite a lot of effort to put it up and all that stuff. You'd want it to do it near a water source rather than far away, because lifting statues is going to be thirsty work. The ahu and moai found near freshwater sources might also have been used to show that it belonged to a specific tribe or clan. In true competitive fashion, the size of the moai, or perhaps some of its features, would indicate the quality of the water. The higher the status and the bigger the statue, the more competitive advantage that tribe had. However, it's possible that the moai were more than just religious icons and served a practical purpose, perhaps without the islanders themselves being aware of it. According to a study by Joanne van Tilburg, the moai were believed to improve agriculture, which made them critical to food production. Excuse me. Van Tilburg's team, which includes geoarchaeologist Sarah Sherwood, spent around 5 years studying two moai excavated the Ranu Raku quarry on the eastern side of the island. The statues were found upright, one on a pedestal and another in a deep hole, suggesting that they weren't awaiting transport to a new location. The researchers also found crescent shapes and other figures carved into the backs of the statues, and a carved human head was found resting against the base of one of the statues. It's possible that these statues were meant to stay where they were, in the quarry, and served a ceremonial purpose, possibly to ensure a good harvest. Because, as it turns out, the quarry was also very productive farmland. After testing soil samples, it became clear that the area around the quarry was producing foods like banana, taro, and sweet potato. Sherwood believes the soil at the quarry is probably the richest on the island and also adjacent to a freshwater source, which made the land ideal for farming. Quarrying of the statues seemed to have further boosted the fertility of the soil. While other soil on the island was being eroded away or leached of elements for plant growth, the smaller fragments of bedrock raining down from the constant quarrying and carving of the statues provided the soil with elements like calcium and phosphorus, which are vital to agriculture. The combination of small bedrock fragments and fresh water created a perfect feedback system, providing the soil with water and natural fertilizer. Similar research done by Mara found that the Rapa Nui people would place basalt pebbles, cobbles, and boulders in the mulch gardens they kept for cultivating yams, sweet potato, and other crops. The stones would trap moisture, and the boulders protected the plants from the winds, but the weathering of the rock also allowed minerals to leach into the soil, boosting nutrient levels and thus improving yields. In a good example of the divine being used to explain source, the Rapa Nui farmers probably didn't realize it was the minerals from the rock shards leaching into the soil, improving their harvest. Rather, they ascribed to the great harvest to divine intervention. Unfortunately, much of the Rapa Nui oral tradition has been lost. While we have many theories, even the descendants of the Rapa Nui still living on the island today don't know why exactly the statues were made. Making large idols containing the spirits of your ancestors and placing them near valuable water and fertile lands, inadvertently making the lands more fertile, seems like the most likely explanation. However, I quite like the idea of people making big statues to show superiority rather than making spears and killing each other. I like the idea, I just don't think it's very likely. Jacob Ragavin, again, butchered his name, and his crew reported that when they arrived on the island in 1722, the statues were still being used by the locals for rituals and religious practices. However, when James Cook arrived in 1774, he found the giant statues in ruins. The moai were such an important part of Rapa Nui culture, that is, why did the islanders stop making them? While the moai standing on their platforms were still in use by the time the first Europeans arrived, archaeologists believe that the moai carving practice reached its peak by the 1500s. However, from the 1600s, things started going in a different direction. According to a local Rapa Nui historian, one of the possible reasons for the end of the moai was the deforestation of the island. Dwindling resources meant the islanders were spending more time building and cultivating specialized rock gardens and gathering what limited resources they could get their hands on, leaving less time for carving and transporting the huge statues all over the island. On top of that, if they needed logs to transport the moai, the lack of trees would have made the transportation much harder or even impossible. If the population further declined due to lack of resources, the Rapa Nui people simply wouldn't have had the manpower necessary to continue carving and moving the great moai. Alternatively, deforestation and lack of resources could have led to societal collapse. With the resources on the island dwindling, the people were starving. So they made their idols big and fat. When they finally ran out of resources, they not only stopped carving the moai, but even toppled their idols, perhaps thinking that their ancestors had abandoned them. More in anger as an act of taking power away from the ancestors who were unwilling to help their people. Eventually, people started killing each other for what resources remained. See, you get there eventually, you know what it's like. We're making better moai than you. But it's like when the resources run real thin, humans are gonna be humans. Obsidian spears points found in a layer of subsoil would seem to support this theory. And even among the islanders themselves, there are tales of cannibalism and general carnage. However, the islanders don't seem to think any less of their ancestors. After all, it was desperate times and all that. Later years saw the rise of the Birdman cult. Rapa Nui didn't have a whole lot of mammals or reptiles, and by the time the islanders were properly deforested, the only thing in abundance was seabirds, probably nesting on safer offshore rocks and small islands. So eventually, as is the nature of all creatures and their beliefs, the Rapa Nui began to consider the birds as more sacred and decided that rather than stone statues, their ancestors were keeping an eye on them from above in the form of feathery friends. With the ancestors moving on from stone statues to birds, there was no longer a need to carve statues for the spirits of the ancestors to reside in. After all, the new homes came with wings and spectacular views. If only they had done that previously. And then they wouldn't have destroyed or potentially possibly destroyed their island-making giant, pointless statues. Not all the moai were toppled intentionally. Some had fallen down due to an earthquake, while many fell over due to neglect or other environmental factors. Once the focus shifted to birds by the mid-1800s, not a single statue was still standing. While many of the moai made it to their final resting place, nearly 400 statues are still awaiting transport at the quarry. That means only a third of the statues reached their final destination. We're not sure quite why so many of the moai never left the quarry. Perhaps moving the larger stone statues just wasn't that easy. Moving the giant heads without breaking the detailed features like the nose and lips would have been quite the challenge. And some broken statues lying at the bottom of slopes indicate that transport didn't always go smoothly. So, how exactly do you move a stone statue weighing a couple of tons if you're not Egypt and you don't have the manpower? If local legends are to be believed, the statues simply got up and walked. Well, we could We could not believe those local legends here at the Dead Reckoning, because obviously it's nonsense. The word, I'm going to butcher it, but neke in the Rapa Nui language literally means walking without legs. And according to the stories, that's exactly how the statues moved. Those who possessed mana or divine power could command the moai to walk from the quarry to their final home. According to legend, only a select few people had enough mana to make the statues move, either by commanding them or by reciting magical chants. Another tale claims that the greatest god of the island, Make, was the one who commanded the statues to move. If you couldn't get a hold of a great chief or the great god, all was not lost. Priests could chant the statues into place. However, if the priests stopped chanting, the statues stopped moving. Some of the statues never made it because an evil spell halted their march, leaving them stranded by the side of the road. Evil spells were also used to topple the standing statues. Apparently, there was an old woman working as a cook for the sculptors who had enough mana to command the statues to walk. When the image makers, as they were called, refused to share their meal, she ordered the statues to fall down. Moral of the story? Don't mess with the cook. However, it seems that the statues could only walk after dark. That must have been quite a sight, and probably not something you'd want to run into unexpectedly on a dark and lonely night. Well, good news, everybody. You're not going to have to, because obviously it's not real. For some inexplicable reason, scientists don't want to accept the theory of statues walking around the island in the dark. And they have some more practical theories to explain how the statues were moved. One theory suggests that the statues were moved by rolling logs or possibly using wooden sleds pulled with rope, similar to how the blocks were moved for building the Great Pyramid of Giza. Joanne Van Tilburg and her team managed to move a 10-ton replica using a sledge moved with eucalyptus rollers and a team of 60 people. This is certainly a plausible method, but 60 people is still a lot if you have a small tribe. However, according to a study done in 2012, the old legends might have some truth to them. Terry Hunt and Carl Lippo decided to give the story of walking statues some consideration. Unlike the ancient Egyptians, the islands couldn't spare too many people to carve and move statues. Cultivating food and finding water were far more important to the people's survival. So what if they walked the statue from the quarry to the ahu by rocking the statue from side to side in the same way that you would move a fridge? Based on the breakage patterns of the statues that didn't quite make it from the quarry to their final home, it became clear to the researchers that the moai were standing upright before they fell, which meant that they weren't being pulled along horizontally on rollers and sledges. The base of the unfinished statues in the quarry, as well as the ones lying on the sides of the road, was wider than those sitting on the ahu. The unfinished statues also lean forward by about 17 degrees, so the center of mass is positioned just over the rounded bottom edge. This allows the statue to roll from side to side. However, leaning so far forward means that they wouldn't have been able to stand by themselves, they would tip over. Lippo theorized that the statues were modeled on how people walk. Essentially, you rotate your hip and fall forward. So the Rapa Nui designed a statue that did the same thing. I think I've heard this theory before, and it's the one I just find the most likely. And that these, who was it, Lippo and the other guy, have cracked this, the statue would rotate and fall forward, moving step by step. Even the paths on the island seem to support this theory. After studying the paths leading from the quarry to the ahu all over the island, the team concluded that the concave paths were designed the way to make it easier for the statue to walk. The moai were probably guided using ropes by a team on either side of it, and a small team behind it to steady the movement. Walking the statue would require a much smaller team than dragging it on a sled. Once the moai arrived at its ahu safe and sound, the final touches would be added and the base reshaped to adjust the center of mass, allowing the statue to now stand upright without assistance. Of course, when you find amazing feats of human engineering, you find aliens. Yes, it's never a Dead Reckoning episode if aliens don't get involved. According to Eric von Daniken, Um, a name I know so well, spouting, in my opinion, allegedly nonsense theories. He's the guy who wrote Chariots of the Gods, who studied the Egyptian pyramids and the giant geoglyphs in Peru. He claimed that the work is too detailed to have been done with the stone tools available, and it must have been done by aliens. A small group of aliens found themselves stranded on Easter Island. Of course they did. Though how they managed to do that is unclear. In an attempt to signal their alien buddies looking for them, they built these huge stone statues with distinct human features and placed them all around the island. Because if your alien comrades are looking for you, they're going to be looking for larger human heads. That makes perfect sense. Perched on their platforms or half buried beneath the ground of Rapa Nui, the moai are still keeping a watchful eye on their people. They may not have been they may have been replaced by a birdman cult in the distant past, so I'm thinking they're probably not fond of birds, but they're the objects of a new kind of worship. Despite not being the easiest travel destination to reach, their visitors are plenty. They may not be considered the source of fertility for agriculture anymore, but they're still looking after the island and the people on it by luring tourists and the money that comes with them. Not something the birds are really doing. We'll probably never know why exactly they were built or how they were moved, but I like to imagine these large statues lumbering across the islands, slowly making their way to the platforms to settle down and spend eternity in contemplation. Who knows, perhaps they're still walking on the darkest nights when no one is watching, bestowing mana on their people and trampling a few seagulls along the way. They're not, because as I've said plenty of times, they're made of stone. So now let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. Do you have any other theories that people haven't really addressed? Let me know. And if you want to support the channel, you can buy us a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/LarryMLease or use the link in the description. As always, thank you so much for watching and listening. We'll see you next time.